A family sent the ugly pregnant daughter as a joke, never imagining what the virgin mountain man would do next. Out on the snow-covered trail, a shivering young woman is cast away like unwanted freight, her family's laughter echoing behind her. She's sent to a stranger in the Bitterroot Mountains, a man who's never even touched a woman's hand, yet lives by a code carved from scripture and solitude. When she steps off that wagon, the town jeers. But the quiet mountain man removes his hat, looks her in the eye, and says 7 words that silence every mocking mouth. From that moment, the storm outside isn't half as fierce as the one that's about to rage inside their hearts. Because in a land where mercy is rarer than gold, he does something no one expects, something that will scandalize the town, defy every rule, and change both their lives forever. Why did he choose her when everyone else turned away? What secret of faith or heartbreak made him see beauty where others saw shame? And when the snow melts, will the mercy that bound them be enough to stand against the world's cruelty? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The wagon wheels creaked beneath Ruthie as dawn's first light painted the Missouri sky in shades of pink and gold. She pulled her threadbare shawl tighter, trying to ward off both the October chill and the echo of cruel laughter that still rang in her ears. "Ain't nothing but freight work you're fit for now," Caleb had sneered, while Horace doubled over with mean-spirited mirth. Their father's belly laugh had cut deepest of all, familiar and foreign at once in its mockery. The driver beside her, a weathered man named Mr. Jenkins, kept his eyes fixed on the road ahead. He'd barely spoken 2 words since they'd set out, and Ruthie was grateful for the silence. It gave her time to press one hand against her swollen belly, hidden beneath her loose dress, and whisper silent prayers into the morning air. Her worn Bible lay heavy in her lap, its pages dog-eared and tear-stained from nights spent seeking comfort in its verses. The leather cover was smooth from years of handling, a gift from her mama on her 10th birthday, before the fever took her, before everything changed. The wagon rocked steadily westward, each turn of the wheels carrying her further from the only home she'd known. The marriage notice had been meant for her sister Sarah. Beautiful Sarah with her golden curls and easy laugh. But Sarah hadn't been the one sent away in disgrace. "Montana Territory needs strong women," the advertisement had read. "God-fearing man seeks wife of good character." Ruthie traced the words in her mind, even as doubt gnawed at her heart. What would this unknown man think when she arrived instead of Sarah, when he saw her plain face and discovered her shame? The sun climbed higher, burning off the morning mist that clung to the fields they passed. Ruthie watched the familiar landscape of home fade into strange territory, each mile marking another step into uncertainty. The baby shifted within her, a flutter of movement that brought both comfort and fear. "Mind if we stop a spell?" Mr. Jenkins finally broke the silence, gesturing to a creek ahead. "Horses could use some water." "Yes, sir, thank you." Ruthie's voice came out barely above a whisper. As the wagon rolled to a stop, she carefully climbed down, mindful of her condition. The ground felt solid beneath her feet, even if everything else in her world had turned to quicksand. She made her way to the creek's edge, kneeling to splash cool water on her face. Her reflection wavered in the rippling surface. Mousy brown hair, eyes too large for her face, cheeks that had lost their roundness as morning sickness took its toll. Not beautiful like Sarah, not worthy of honest love, according to her family. "Best get moving soon," Mr. Jenkins called out, already watering the horses. "Long way yet to Montana." Ruthie nodded, smoothing her skirts as she stood. The morning sun caught something glinting in her pocket, the small tin cross her mama had pressed into her hand on her deathbed. "Remember, child," she'd whispered, "God's mercy is bigger than man's cruelty." Back on the wagon seat, Ruthie watched the sunrise she was leaving behind. The same sun would rise in Montana, she told herself. The same God would be there too, even if she arrived to find no waiting bridegroom, no welcome, no kindness at all. "Lord," she prayed softly, one hand pressed to her belly, the other clutching her Bible, "just let someone be kind." The driver clucked to the horses, and the wagon rolled on. Mile after mile of autumn-touched countryside passed in silence, broken only by the creak of wood and leather, the steady clip of hooves, the occasional cry of a hawk riding the wind above. Ruthie's thoughts drifted to that fateful night 6 months ago, when Deacon Marshall had cornered her in the church storage room after prayer meeting. His sweet words had turned to demands, his gentle manner to force. She'd been too shocked, too afraid to cry out. Afterward, he'd straightened his collar, called her a temptress, and warned that no one would believe her over a man of God. He'd been right about that. When her condition became apparent, the whispers started, the sideways glances, the knowing smirks. Even her own family had turned against her, refusing to hear her tearful explanation. The deacon's wife had led the charge in spreading tales of Ruthie's wickedness, while the man himself stood righteous in his pulpit each Sunday. A bump in the road jolted her from these dark memories. Mr. Jenkins offered her a water skin without looking her way. She accepted it gratefully, taking small sips as she watched fence posts and scattered farmhouses give way to more open country. The letter responding to the marriage advertisement was folded in her Bible, her father's cruel joke made manifest in ink and paper. She hadn't read it since that morning in the kitchen, when she'd found Caleb and Horace bent double with laughter, waving it in her face. "Somebody out there won't mind damaged goods," Horace had wheezed between guffaws, "even if it ain't the man expecting pretty Sarah to step off that wagon." Caleb had wiped tears of mirth from his eyes. "Maybe he'll put you to work with his livestock. Ain't much difference between freight and fallen women." Their father's boom of approval had driven her from the house, but not before she heard him declare, "Let her go west. Good riddance to bad blood." Now, as the morning wore on toward noon, Ruthie found herself wondering about the man who'd written seeking a wife. Would he turn her away on sight? Send her back in disgrace? Or worse, would he be cruel, seeing her desperate situation as a chance to gain a servant rather than a wife? "Stop that now," she whispered to herself, one hand unconsciously moving to touch her mama's cross through the fabric of her pocket. "The Lord tests but doesn't abandon." The baby moved again, stronger this time, as if agreeing. Ruthie allowed herself a small smile, the first since leaving home. Whatever waited in Montana, she had this small life to protect, to love, to raise in the light of God's grace rather than man's judgment. Mr. Jenkins cleared his throat. "There's bread and cheese in that sack by your feet, miss. Best keep up your strength." The simple kindness in his gruff voice brought tears to Ruthie's eyes. "Much obliged, sir." They shared the simple meal in companionable silence as the wagon rolled on. The sun climbed higher, warming the autumn air. Ruthie found her prayers shifting from desperate pleas for mercy to quiet gratitude for small blessings. The gentle breeze, the driver's consideration, the steady movement of the child within her. A flock of geese passed overhead, their V formation pointing west like a compass needle. Ruthie watched them until they disappeared into the distance, carrying her thoughts forward to the uncertain future awaiting her. "Lord," she prayed again, softer now, more resigned than desperate. "Just let someone be kind." The wagon creaked onward, bearing its cargo of hope and heartbreak toward whatever lay ahead in Montana territory. Ruthie kept her eyes fixed on the horizon, determination gradually replacing fear in her heart. She might arrive unwanted, unexpected, unworthy in the world's eyes. But she would arrive standing tall, her mama's cross in her pocket and her father's cruelty left behind in the dust of Missouri. The autumn sun continued its arc across the sky, casting Ruthie's shadow behind her as she rode west. Each mile marked another step away from shame and toward possibility, even if that possibility held no more promise than honest work and a quiet place to raise her child. Mr. Jenkins began to whistle softly, an old hymn tune that Ruthie recognized from Sunday services. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. The familiar melody carried on the wind, and Ruthie found herself humming along, her voice growing stronger with each note. I once was lost, but now am found, was blind, but now I see. The wagon rolled on toward Montana territory, bearing its unexpected cargo of faith, fear, and fragile hope into the growing day. Behind them, Missouri faded into memory, while ahead lay only questions, and the chance, however slim, of finding kindness in a stranger's eyes. The late October wind cut across the prairie like a knife, driving needle-sharp sleet against the canvas covers of the wagon train. Ruthie pulled her thin shawl tighter, grateful for the shelter of the cook wagon, even as smoke from the wet wood stung her eyes. Her fingers, red and chapped from the cold, moved steadily as she chopped vegetables for the evening stew. "Mind you cut them carrots smaller, girl," Mrs. Peterson instructed from her perch on a crate. The older woman's sharp eyes missed nothing, though her arthritic hands kept her from doing the work herself. "Them menfolk won't eat chunks bigger than their thumbs." "Yes, ma'am." Ruthie adjusted her cutting, making each piece precisely the size of her thumbnail. After 3 weeks on the trail, she knew the preferences of every driver and passenger, who liked their coffee strong, who needed extra salt, who wouldn't touch onions. Small knowledge, but it helped her feel useful. Behind her, she caught the whispers of 2 women drawing water. Carrying another man's child? Family sent her away. Poor creature. Ruthie's knife never faltered, though her cheeks burned. The whispers had followed her since joining the wagon train, but she'd learned to let them roll past like the endless prairie winds. Her work spoke louder than gossip: hot meals, mended clothes, clean dishes, and no complaints. That evening, as the travelers huddled in their wagons against the growing storm, Ruthie sat cross-legged in her small tent. By lantern light, she opened her mother's prayer book, its leather cover worn smooth by years of faithful hands. Between the pages, she kept her own careful record of the journey. 23rd day on the trail, she wrote in careful script. Mountains growing closer, baby active today, perhaps sensing the changes in the air. Lord grant us safe passage through the storms ahead. The mountains loomed larger with each passing day, their snow-capped peaks piercing the gray autumn sky. They filled Ruthie with equal parts wonder and apprehension. Somewhere in those valleys waited Matthew Thorne, a name that had become both prayer and puzzle in her mind. When the wagon train finally creaked into Helena Station, ice crystallized on every surface, and the wind howled between the wooden buildings. The station master took one look at the western sky and shook his head. "Storm's coming. Big one. You'll all be staying put for at least 2 days." Ruthie helped set up camp in the relative shelter of the station's lee side. As she worked, she couldn't help overhearing 2 freight drivers talking by the corral. "Thorne? Yeah, I know of him. Keeps to himself up in Bitterroot Valley. Religious sort. Builds chapel furniture when he ain't trapping. Strange one, that. Lives alone out there, reading his Bible and talking to his horses. Never comes to town except for supplies and post. Still, fair man in his dealings. Pays honest prices for pelts." Ruthie absorbed every word, turning them over in her mind as she worked. A solitary man. Religious. Strange. Was this God's answer to her prayers for kindness, or another cruel joke of fate? The storm kept them in Helena for 2 full days. Ruthie spent the time making herself useful, cooking for the station hands, mending torn clothes, helping the station master's wife organize supplies. She avoided the saloon where most travelers gathered, preferring the quiet company of her prayer book and her thoughts. On the morning of the 3rd day, the storm cleared enough for travel. But while the wagon train turned north, Ruthie found herself climbing aboard a single freight wagon bound west for Elk Crossing. The driver, a weathered man named Porter, helped her up with surprising gentleness. 6 hours to Elk Crossing, weather permitting, he said, clucking to his team. Last post office before Bitterroot Valley. The wagon lurched forward, wheels crunching through fresh snow. Ruthie watched Helena Station disappear into the whiteness, clutching her mother's prayer book close. The other passengers, 2 miners and a young couple, huddled under blankets, leaving her alone with her thoughts. The day passed in a blur of white sky and darker mountains. Ruthie watched the landscape change, becoming wilder with each mile. Pine forests replaced the prairie grass. The air grew thinner, crisper. Even the snow felt different here, lighter, more delicate. As afternoon faded toward evening, Porter pointed ahead to a cluster of lights glowing through the falling snow. Elk Crossing, he announced. End of the line for today. The wagon clattered down the settlement's single street, really just a row of rough wooden buildings facing each other across the rutted snow. A general store, a stable, a small church, a 2-story building marked Hotel and Post Office. Yellow lamplight spilled from windows, and smoke rose straight up from chimneys in the still, cold air. Ruthie sat very straight as the wagon rolled to a stop, one hand pressed against her belly where the baby kicked restlessly. This was it, the last outpost before whatever waited in Bitterroot Valley. Before Matthew Thorne. The sun had set completely now, turning the falling snow to silver in the lamplight. Ruthie watched the flakes swirl and dance, remembering her mother's words about God's mercy. She would need that mercy now, in this strange place so far from everything she'd known. The freight wagon creaked to a halt in front of the hotel. Porter jumped down to help her, but Ruthie waited a moment, gathering her courage. Through the swirling snow, she could just make out the dark line of mountains to the west, the Bitterroot Range, where her uncertain future waited. "Miss," Porter called up, "best get inside before the snow gets worse." Ruthie nodded, clutching her small bag of belongings. With one hand supporting her back, she began the careful climb down into the unknown. Matthew Thorne's arms strained as he hefted the last barrel of salted pork onto the post office loading dock. Winter supplies couldn't wait, not with storm clouds building dark over the Bitterroot Mountains. He straightened his tall frame, working out the stiffness in his lower back. The November wind bit through his wool coat, carrying the sharp scent of snow. Inside the post office, the pot-bellied stove radiated blessed warmth. Matthew nodded to Jim Porter, the clerk, who sat behind his desk sorting mail with ink-stained fingers. The older man's eyes crinkled with barely contained amusement. "Special delivery coming in on today's Helena wagon, Matthew," Porter said, failing to hide his grin. "Your mail-order bride, if I ain't mistaken." Heat crept up Matthew's neck, coloring his unshaven cheeks. He'd placed that advertisement months ago, prompted by his dying mother's last wish to see him settled. "A good woman," she'd whispered, clutching his hand. "Someone to soften your solitude, son." He'd agreed just to ease her passing, never expecting anything to come of it. "Ain't my bride," Matthew muttered, adjusting his coat collar. "Advertisement was for my neighbor up valley. Must be some mistake." Porter chuckled, shuffling through papers. "No mistake. Response came addressed clear as day to Matthew Thorne, Bitterroot Valley. Looks like you're getting hitched, old son." Matthew frowned at his boots. He hadn't checked his mail in 2 months, too busy preparing for winter. The thought of some poor woman traveling all this way based on false hopes twisted his gut with guilt. The post office door swung open, letting in a blast of cold air and Harry Webb, the livery stable owner. "Storm's rolling in fast," Harry announced, stamping snow from his boots. "Helena wagon's running late. Might not make it through before dark." Matthew sighed, looking out the frosted window at his own wagon, already loaded with supplies. He should head home now, before the weather worsened. His horses didn't like breaking trail in deep snow, and the mountain passes could be treacherous after dark. Just then, the distant jingle of harness bells drifted through the swirling snow. The Helena wagon appeared at the end of the street, moving slowly through the gathering dusk. A small crowd gathered on the post office porch, drawn by curiosity about the arrival. Matthew hung back in the doorway, watching as the wagon creaked to a stop. Porter elbowed past him, grinning broadly. "Time to meet. Your bride, Matthew." The wagon driver jumped down, offering his hand to someone still hidden behind the canvas cover. A young woman emerged slowly, one hand pressed against her swollen belly. Matthew's breath caught as the crowd fell silent. She was visibly with child, her plain face pale with exhaustion and cold. Someone in the crowd snickered. The sound grew, spreading into open laughter. Matthew saw the woman flinch, though she held her head high. Her eyes, when she raised them, were gentle despite their pain, the eyes of someone used to bearing burdens with grace. The laughter grew crueler. "Looks like you got more than you bargained for, Thorne," someone called out. "Better check that advertisement fine print." Matthew felt something shift inside him, like ice breaking up on a spring river. Without conscious thought, he stepped forward, removing his hat. The woman's eyes met his, filled with a mixture of fear and desperate hope that struck him to his core. "You've had a long road, ma'am," he said quietly, his deep voice carrying clearly through the suddenly hushed crowd. "Let's get you out of the wind." The silence that followed was absolute. Matthew stepped forward, offering his arm. Up close he could see she was trembling, though whether from cold or fear he couldn't tell. She hesitated only a moment before placing her small, gloved hand in the crook of his elbow. "Thank you, Mr. Thorne," she whispered. "Matthew, ma'am, and you are?" Ruthie Callahan." He nodded, guiding her carefully down the icy steps. The crowd parted silently, their earlier mirth replaced by something like shame. Matthew helped Ruthie to his wagon, taking care she had secure footing on the snow-slick running board. Her bag was light, just a small carpet bag, and what looked like a well-worn prayer book. Once she was settled, Matthew turned back to the wagon driver. "Much obliged for bringing her safe, Porter." He pressed a coin into the man's hand, then swung up onto the wagon seat beside Ruthie. The horses shifted restlessly, their breath steaming in the cold air. Matthew gathered the reins, acutely aware of the woman beside him, of her quiet dignity in the face of cruel laughter. Something protective stirred in his chest, an unfamiliar feeling for a man long accustomed to solitude. "It's an hour's drive to my cabin," he said softly as they pulled away from the post office. "Road gets rough past the valley mouth, but these horses know the way blind. You warm enough?" Ruthie nodded, clutching her prayer book. "Yes, thank you." She paused, then added hesitantly, "Mr. Thorne, Matthew, there's something you should know." "About the baby?" His voice was gentle, without judgment. "Reckon that's between you and the Lord, ma'am. We've all got burdens to bear." He felt her relax slightly beside him, though she remained silent. The wagon moved steadily through the thickening snow, leaving the lights of Elk Crossing behind. Around them, the wilderness closed in, dark pines heavy with snow, the mountains a looming presence in the gathering dark. Matthew kept his eyes on the road. but he was aware of every small movement from his passenger. The way she braced herself against the wagon's jolts, how she tucked the blanket more securely around her middle, the soft sound of her prayers when the wheels slipped on ice. Each detail added to the growing certainty in his heart that, whatever circumstances had brought her here, God's hand was in it. The snow fell harder as they climbed, big wet flakes that clung to everything they touched. Matthew's horses plowed steadily forward, their hooves breaking trail through the deepening white. The only sounds were the creak of harness leather, the muffled thud of hooves, and the soft whisper of falling snow. "Almost home," Matthew said, as they turned onto a narrower track. "Cabin's just beyond those pines. Smoke's still rising. Stove will be warm inside." Ruthie stirred from her quiet contemplation. "You left the stove burning while you were in town?" "Banking coals is an art in mountain winters," he explained. "Keep them just right, they'll wait all day to welcome you home." The cabin emerged from the snowy darkness, a solid structure of squared logs with a stone chimney. Light gleamed through 2 windows, and smoke rose straight up into the still air. Matthew pulled the wagon under a lean-to shelter built against the cabin's side. "Wait here while I check inside," he said, jumping down. "Won't take but a minute to stir up the fire." He moved quickly through his evening routine, adding wood to the stove, lighting the oil lamp, setting the kettle to boil. The familiar tasks helped settle the strangeness of knowing someone waited outside, someone who would change the quiet patterns of his life. When he returned to help Ruthie down, she was staring up at the cabin with an expression he couldn't quite read. Hope? Fear? A mixture of both, perhaps. Her hands trembled slightly as she took his offered support. "Welcome home, Mrs. Callahan," Matthew said softly as he led her to the door. "It ain't much, but it's warm and dry, and there's plenty of food laid by for winter." They paused on the threshold, both suddenly aware of the moment's wait. Then Ruthie squared her shoulders and stepped forward into the lamplight, bringing with her the promise of change, of healing, of God's quiet mercies working in ways neither of them could have foreseen. The wind picked up as Matthew's wagon climbed higher into the mountains, driving needles of snow against their faces. He glanced at Ruthie, noting how she hunched deeper into the blanket, one hand protectively curved around her middle. The horses struggled against deepening drifts, their breaths coming in great steaming clouds. "Not much further now," Matthew said, his deep voice barely carrying over the howl of the storm. "Trail gets steep here, ma'am. Best hold tight." Ruthie gripped the wagon seat as they began to climb. The wooden wheels creaked and groaned, searching for purchase on the ice-slicked path. Matthew handled the reins with careful precision, murmuring encouragement to his team. The pines loomed close on either side, their branches heavy with snow. A particularly fierce gust caught them broadside. Ruthie gasped as the wagon lurched, but Matthew's steady hand kept them true. She could feel the strength in his arm where it pressed against hers, solid as the mountains themselves. "Lord, keep us," she whispered, her words whipped away by the wind. Matthew heard her anyway. "He will, ma'am. These horses know their business, and we're almost home." The word home caught in Ruthie's throat. She hadn't had a real home since that terrible morning when her father had discovered her condition. The memory of his rage, of her brother's mockery, still burned. She pressed her hand harder against her swollen belly, feeling the baby shift restlessly. Finally, through the curtain of white, Ruthie saw warm lamplight spilling from cabin windows. Matthew guided the team under the lean-to shelter, where the wind's fury couldn't reach them. He jumped down quickly, coming around to her side of the wagon. "Careful now," he said, offering his arms. "Steps might be icy." Ruthie allowed him to help her down, grateful for his steady support. Her legs felt wooden after the long ride, and the baby's weight made her awkward. Matthew kept one hand under her elbow as he led her to the cabin door. Inside, the air was cool, but not frozen. Matthew immediately went to the iron stove, where banked coals glowed dully. He added kindling and small splits of wood with practiced movements, coaxing the fire back to life. Ruthie stood just inside the door, taking in her surroundings. The cabin was small but solid, with 2 rooms divided by a partial wall. The main room held the stove, a table with 2 chairs, some storage shelves, and a rocking chair near the fire. Through the doorway, she glimpsed a narrow bed in the back room. Everything was neat and clean, if plain. "Please sit by the stove," Matthew said, gesturing to the rocker. "I need to see to the horses, but I'll be quick. There's some stew left from morning that we can heat." Ruthie sank into the chair gratefully, her cold, numbed fingers tingling as they warmed. She could hear Matthew moving efficiently outside, caring for the team and securing the wagon. The familiar sounds of livestock being tended brought unexpected tears to her eyes. How long had it been since anyone had shown such simple consideration? Matthew stamped the snow from his boots before coming back inside. He hung his coat by the door, then moved to check the stew pot warming on the stove. The domestic routine felt strange, yet comforting. "Mr. Thorne," Ruthie began hesitantly, "I should explain—" He turned to face her, his expression gentle. "No need for formality here. Matthew will do." He stirred the stew, then seemed to gather his thoughts. "Truth is, I ought to explain myself first. That advertisement, it wasn't rightly my idea." Ruthie's heart clenched, but she kept her voice steady. "Oh?" "My mother—" He paused, pain flickering across his features. "Before she passed last spring, she worried about me being alone up here. Made me promise to try finding someone who might want to share the work. Share prayers. Not marriage exactly, just—" He trailed off, looking uncomfortable. "Company?" Ruthie supplied softly. Matthew nodded. "Yes, ma'am. Someone to help tend the place. Maybe teach Sunday lessons to the children over in Elk Crossing. Mother always said a woman's touch was needed there." He ladled stew into 2 bowls, setting one before her with a piece of cornbread. "Never expected. Well, won't turn you out, especially not in weather like this, but you should know what you're walking into." Ruthie looked down at her bowl, where chunks of venison and potato floated in rich broth. The simple meal brought another wave of tears, which she blinked back firmly. "I'm due in February," she whispered. Matthew settled into the other chair, breaking his cornbread methodically. "Figured as much. Like I said before, that's between you and the Lord." He ate a few bites, then added, "Cabin's warm, food's plenty. You're welcome to stay, help as you can. No obligations beyond that." The kindness in his voice undid her careful composure. Ruthie pressed her hands to her face, trying to hold back sobs. She heard Matthew's chair scrape back, felt his awkward, hovering presence. After a moment, something soft brushed her arm. A clean handkerchief, she realized through her tears. "Thank you," she managed, wiping her eyes. "I'm sorry. I don't usually—" "No need to apologize. Reckon you've had a hard road." Matthew returned to his chair, giving her space to collect herself. "Mother always said tears can be healing, like spring rain." They finished their meal in comfortable silence, broken only by the howl of wind and the occasional boom of snow sliding off the roof. The lamp cast warm shadows on the log walls, and the stove's heat gradually drove the chill from Ruthie's bones. When the bowls were empty, Matthew reached for a worn Bible on the shelf. "Mother's tradition," he explained. "Reading before bed. Would you mind?" Ruthie shook her head, settling deeper into her chair. Matthew opened to Psalms, his big fingers surprisingly gentle with the thin pages. His voice was rough but sincere as he began to read. "The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. The familiar words washed over Ruthie like a balm. She closed her eyes, letting Matthew's deep voice blend with the storm's fury outside. For the first time in months, she felt something close to peace. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Matthew closed the Bible carefully. There's a bed ready in the back room. I'll sleep out here by the stove. He hesitated, then added, God sends help sometimes in ways we don't expect. Maybe that's what's happening here. Ruthie nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. She took the lamp he offered and made her way to the small bedroom. The narrow bed was neatly made with clean blankets that smelled of pine smoke and cold air. As she lay in the darkness, listening to Matthew's quiet movements in the other room, Ruthie finally allowed her tears to flow freely. She cried for her lost innocence, for her family's cruelty, for the uncertain future facing her child. But mixed with the grief was something new, a fragile spark of hope, kindled by simple kindness and the sound of psalms read in a storm-wrapped cabin. Through the wall, she heard Matthew's low voice raised in prayer, asking for guidance. The words themselves were indistinct, but their earnest sincerity wrapped around her like a blanket. Snow continued to thunder on the roof as Ruthie drifted into exhausted sleep, her cheeks still damp with tears. Dawn crept pale and silent over the snow-buried valley. Inside the cabin, Ruthie woke to the sound of murmured prayer. She lay still for a moment, watching her breath cloud in the cold air, before carefully rising from the narrow bed. The main room was dim, lit only by the gray light filtering through frosted windows. Matthew knelt beside the banked hearth, his broad shoulders bowed in devotion. His voice was barely above a whisper, but she caught fragments of his earnest petition. Wisdom to do right. Protect her and the innocent one. Show me your will. Ruthie stepped back quietly, not wanting to interrupt his private communion. But a floorboard creaked beneath her foot, and Matthew's prayer trailed off. He rose smoothly from his knees, turning to face her. Good morning, he said softly. Storm's still holding. Might have us shut in for days yet. Ruthie nodded, wrapping her shawl tighter. I can help with breakfast. Least I can do after your kindness. Matthew shook his head as he moved to stoke the fire. No kindness in it, just doing what's right. He paused, poker in hand. Been thinking on that all night, matter of fact, about what's right. Before Ruthie could respond, a sharp rapping came at the door. Matthew frowned, setting aside the poker. Must be Reverend Hayes. He sometimes stops here on his circuit between settlements. He opened the door to reveal a slight figure wrapped in layers of wool, snow crusted on his beard and the crude snowshoes strapped to his boots. The preacher stamped his feet on the threshold, shaking off drifts of white. Brother Thorne, the Lord's blessing on this house. Reverend Hayes stepped inside, his bright eyes taking in Ruthie's presence. A flash of understanding crossed his weathered face. Ah, I see I'm not your only visitor in this storm. Matthew's jaw tightened. He shut the door against the wind and turned to face the preacher, squarely. Reverend, before you head to town, I have a request. Ruthie's heart began to pound as Matthew crossed to stand beside her. His presence was solid, protective, though he didn't touch her. This is Miss Ruthie Callahan, Matthew said formally. She arrived yesterday, sent by her family. He paused, then continued with quiet determination. I'm asking you to marry us, this morning, if you're willing. The cabin fell silent, except for the crack and pop of the fire. Ruthie stared at Matthew, her lips parted in shock. The preacher studied them both thoughtfully, stroking his frosted beard. Marriage is a serious covenant, Brother Thorne, not to be entered lightly or in haste. "No woman under my roof shall bear shame," Matthew declared, his deep voice firm with conviction. "The Lord sent her here. I aim to do right by his providence." Ruthie found her voice at last, though it trembled. "Mr. Thorne." "Matthew, you don't have to do this. I don't expect—" He turned to her, his eyes gentle but determined. "It's not about expecting. It's about choosing what's right. If you're willing, I'll give you my name, my protection, my honest work." He hesitated. "Can't promise more than that right now. But I'll try to be a good husband, in time." Tears spilled down Ruthie's cheeks. After months of scorn and cruelty, this man's simple offering of dignity overwhelmed her. She nodded, unable to speak. Reverend Hayes removed his heavy coat, revealing the worn collar of his profession. "Very well. If you're both certain, I'll perform the ceremony, though it's among the stranger weddings I've presided over." He smiled kindly at Ruthie. "Got your Bible handy, Brother Thorne?" Matthew retrieved his mother's Bible from the shelf, while the preacher cleared his throat. "We'll need bread for the blessing, and water, if you have it." "Fresh spring water in the kitchen barrel," Matthew said. He brought out a loaf of bread and filled 2 tin cups with clear water. The preacher positioned them before the hearth, where morning light now streamed through the windows, setting the snow-reflected brilliance dancing on the log walls. He opened the Bible to the Book of Ruth, the pages crackling in the quiet cabin. "Dearly beloved," he began, his voice carrying the weight of sacred duty. "We are gathered here in the sight of God to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony." Ruthie stood trembling beside Matthew as the preacher spoke of covenant and grace. When it came time for the vows, Matthew's strong voice never wavered. He promised to protect and provide, to be faithful and true. Ruthie's own responses were soft but steady, even through her tears. The Reverend blessed the bread and water, speaking of Christ's first miracle at Cana. They each ate a morsel of bread and sipped the cold, sweet spring water. The simple elements became holy in that moment, sanctifying their unexpected union. "What God has joined together, let no man put asunder," Reverend Hayes pronounced. "I now present Mr. and Mrs. Matthew Thorne." Matthew reached for Ruthie's hand then, holding it carefully in his large one. His calloused thumb brushed across her knuckles in a gesture that felt like a promise. The preacher stayed only long enough to warm himself by the fire and record their marriage in his official book. Soon he was gone, leaving fresh tracks in the deep snow as he made his way toward town. Ruthie stood at the window, watching until the preacher disappeared into the swirling white. Behind her, she heard Matthew moving about the cabin, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. A rhythmic scraping sound made her turn. He knelt by one of the main support posts, carefully carving into the timber with his knife. When he finished, he sat back on his heels. Ruthie moved closer to see what he'd written. There in the solid oak beam, the letters stood clear and deep. Ruth Thorne. "So you'll know you belong here," Matthew said quietly, "that this is your home now, proper and legal." Fresh tears spilled down Ruthie's cheeks. She pressed her hand to the carved letters, feeling the rough edges of her new name beneath her fingers. Behind her, Matthew rose and moved to add wood to the fire. As evening settled over the snow-locked valley, wolves began their haunting chorus in the darkness beyond the cabin walls. But inside, lamplight gleamed warm on the fresh carved letters, and 2 strangers who were now husband and wife shared their first meal as a family. Matthew read from Psalms again before bed, his voice stronger than the night before. When he finished, he looked at Ruthie across the lamplight. "I'll still sleep out here by the stove. Nothing has to change yet except that you're safe now. Protected." Ruthie nodded, grateful for his understanding. "Thank you," she whispered. "For everything." "Thank the Lord," he replied simply. "He knows what he's about, even when we don't see it clear at first." That night, as Ruthie lay in her bed, listening to the wolves' song mingle with the storm's fury, she felt the first real warmth of belonging since she'd left Missouri. Her hand strayed to her swollen belly, where the baby shifted restlessly. "We're home," she whispered to her unborn child. "By God's mercy, we're finally home." Through the wall, she could hear Matthew's deep voice raised in evening prayer. The sound wrapped around her like a blanket, more comforting than any she'd known before. Outside, the wolves called to each other in the gathering night, but their wild voices held no terror now. She was safe. She was protected. She belonged. Sleep came easily, deep and peaceful, as the storm raged on outside their sheltered cabin. The morning after their wedding dawned bright and still. The storm had spent its fury overnight, leaving the world wrapped in pristine white. Ruthie woke to the sound of Matthew's axe splitting wood outside and the unfamiliar weight of her new gold band, plain and thin, on her finger. She dressed quickly, in the cold room, wrapping her shawl tight around her shoulders. When she opened the cabin door, her breath caught at the beauty before her. Sunlight sparkled on untouched snow that stretched to the dark line of pines. The mountains rose sharp and clear against a perfect blue sky. Matthew paused in his work, axe resting on his shoulder. "Morning," he said quietly. Storms broke at last. "It's beautiful," Ruthie breathed, taking in the transformed landscape. He nodded. "Thought I might show you around today. Need to teach you about the cow and such, if you're feeling up to it." "I'd like that," she said, meaning it. After days trapped inside, she was eager to learn her new home. After a simple breakfast of cornmeal mush and coffee, Matthew led her to the small barn. Inside, a red-brown cow stood in her stall, steam rising from her broad back in the cold air. "This here's Maple," Matthew said, running a gentle hand down the cow's flank. "She's patient with new folks, aren't you, girl?" He demonstrated the milking technique, his large hands somehow managing the delicate task with practiced ease. "You want to grip firm but gentle," he explained. "Find your rhythm and stick to it." Ruthie settled onto the low stool, positioning her hands as he'd shown her. Her first attempts were clumsy, producing only a thin stream of milk that mostly missed the bucket. Matthew stood quietly nearby, offering occasional guidance. "Like this?" she asked, adjusting her grip. "That's better," he encouraged. "Just remember, firm but gentle." After several minutes, she found her rhythm. The steady sound of milk hitting the bucket filled the barn, accompanied by Maple's contented lowing. "There you have it," Matthew said, and Ruthie looked up to catch the hint of a smile beneath his beard. The praise, simple as it was, warmed her. Next, he showed her the woodpile behind the cabin. "Always need kindling," he explained, selecting a smaller log. "I'll split the big pieces, but you should know how to make proper kindling yourself." He demonstrated the technique, showing her how to hold the axe and position the wood. "Mind your fingers," he cautioned. "Start slow and careful." Ruthie's first few swings went wild, barely marking the wood. Matthew stepped closer, adjusting her grip on the axe handle. "Try again," he said. "You've got the strength. Just need to find the right angle." Her next swing connected solidly, splitting the piece in two. The sharp crack of success startled a laugh from her throat. The first real laugh she'd managed in months. The sound seemed to surprise them both. Matthew's eyes crinkled at the corners. "Well done," he said simply, but his approval was clear. They settled into a rhythm over the following days. Matthew would rise before dawn to check his trap lines and haul wood, returning mid-morning with fresh game or fish. Ruthie kept the cabin, learning to manage the wood stove's temperamental nature and experiment with the stores of dried goods in the root cellar. One morning, Matthew brought in the mail along with his day's catch, a sealed letter from Reverend Hayes, the circuit preacher who had married them. Matthew read it silently by the window, while Ruthie kneaded bread dough at the table. She saw his shoulders tense as he read. Without a word, he folded the letter and tucked it into his shirt pocket. He didn't mention it, but that evening she noticed him take it out again, studying it with a troubled expression before adding it to the fire. It was only later, when Ruthie collected the day's eggs, that she found the envelope had blown beneath the chicken coop. The preacher's warning was clear. Quick marriages bring quick ruin. She quietly returned the envelope to the flames, understanding now Matthew's silence. Their evenings developed their own gentle pattern. After supper, they would sit by the fire, while Matthew read from Scripture. His voice grew more confident with each passing night, though he still stumbled sometimes over the longer words. Ruthie would mend or knit as she listened, finding comfort in the familiar verses. Sometimes they shared stories as the fire burned low. Matthew spoke of his mother's quiet faith and her final wish for him to find companionship. Ruthie told him about her childhood on the Missouri farm, carefully avoiding mention of recent events. "Ma taught me to make soap from wood ash and tallow," she said one evening, working on a pair of worn socks, "and how to predict weather by watching the birds." "My mother had sayings for weather too," Matthew replied, stoking the fire. "Red sky at morning, sailors take warning. Red sky at night, sailors delight." "We had that one too," Ruthie smiled. These simple exchanges helped bridge the strange space between their shared life and separate pasts. The early December days fell into a comfortable routine. Every morning, Ruthie would milk Maple while Matthew checked his trap lines. She learned to recognize the different birds that visited their yard: chickadees, nuthatches, and the bold whiskey jacks that would snatch crumbs from the doorstep. She discovered which floors creaked and how to bank the fire just right to last through the night. Matthew brought home rabbits and grouse for the pot, teaching her how to clean and prepare them properly. Though still quiet by nature, he began to share small observations about his day, where he'd seen deer tracks, which streams were starting to freeze, how the beaver dams were holding against the early winter floods. One evening, as they sat down to a supper of rabbit stew and fresh bread, Ruthie noticed Matthew's hand resting on the table near hers as he reached for the salt. His fingers, roughened by work and weather, paused for a moment beside her own. The simple proximity sent an unexpected warmth through her chest. She glanced up to find him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. He drew his hand back slowly, returning to his meal without comment, but something had shifted in that brief moment. A seed of something tender taking root in the quiet space between them. The fire crackled in the hearth, and outside, the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky. Ruthie breathed in the familiar scents of wood smoke and fresh bread, of leather and wool and winter air. For the first time since leaving Missouri, she felt truly at peace. Matthew cleared his throat softly. "Stew's good," he said. "Thank you," she replied, and meant it for more than just the compliment. They finished their meal in companionable silence as night settled over their mountain home. The simple routines they'd built, the careful consideration they showed each other, the growing ease of shared spaces, all of it felt like the beginning of something real and lasting, something that might one day bloom into more than mere convenience or obligation. Ruthie rested her hand where his had been, feeling the lingering warmth on the worn wooden table. Outside, an owl called into the gathering dark, its voice carrying across the snow-covered valley. Inside, the lamplight gleamed soft on the carved letters of her new name, still fresh in the cabin's supporting beam. Ruth Thorne. No longer a joke or an unwanted burden, but a woman finding her place in this quiet corner of the world, one small domestic piece at a time. Matthew guided his wagon through the thin December sunlight toward Elk Crossing. Fresh snow blanketed the trail, muffling the creak of wooden wheels and the steady clip of hooves. He needed supplies: flour, sugar, salt, and more coffee. The list Ruthie had written in her neat hand lay folded in his coat pocket. The town appeared through the bare trees, smoke rising from chimneys against the pale morning sky. Matthew pulled his team to a halt outside the general store, his boots crunching in the fresh snow as he climbed down. Inside, warmth from the pot-bellied stove wrapped around him like a blanket. "Morning, Thorne." Old Mr. Jensen nodded from behind the counter. "Got your usual order ready." Matthew handed over Ruthie's list. As Jensen gathered the items, the bell above the door chimed. Tom Wheeler, the postal clerk, stepped in, stamping snow from his boots. "Mail came through from back east," Wheeler announced. "Got something for you, Thorne." Matthew accepted the envelope, noting the Missouri postmark. His mother's sister still lived there, perhaps news from home. He tucked it away while Jensen totaled his purchases. Outside again, Matthew settled onto a barrel near the hitching post to read the letter. The paper trembled slightly in his calloused hands as he unfolded it. The neat script delivered its blow without mercy. "Your father's final acts have come to light. Before his death, he led a group of vigilantes who hanged 3 men accused of horse theft. We've since learned they were innocent travelers, a father and his 2 sons passing through. The widow still grieves." Matthew's throat tightened. He'd known his father as a hard man, quick to anger. But this? The letter continued, describing how the truth had emerged when one of the other vigilantes confessed on his deathbed. His hands shook as he folded the paper away. The weight of inherited sin pressed down on his shoulders like lead. How could he tell Ruthie? She'd trusted him, accepted his offer of protection. Would she see the same darkness in him that had lived in his father? The store door opened, spilling lamplight onto the snow. 2 women emerged, their voices carrying clearly in the cold air. "Did you hear about that trapper Thorne?" one whispered. "Married some girl from back east, pregnant and unwed, they say." "Well, birds of a feather," the other replied. "My Henry says Thorne's got his own sins to hide. Why else would a man live alone so long, then suddenly marry damaged goods?" Matthew's jaw clenched. He waited until they passed, then rose stiffly and began loading his wagon. More townspeople drifted by, their stares cold and knowing. Some whispered behind raised hands. Others simply looked away. The general store bell chimed again. Ruthie emerged, carrying a small package wrapped in brown paper. She'd insisted on coming to town to choose fabric for baby clothes. Now she stood uncertainly on the wooden sidewalk, clearly sensing the hostile atmosphere. Matthew moved quickly to her side, taking the package and helping her down the steps. He kept his shoulders squared, creating a barrier between her and the townsfolk's judgment. Together they walked to the wagon, ignoring the whispers that followed them. Snow began falling as they left town, fat flakes drifting between them like the secrets they each carried. Ruthie sat quietly beside him, one hand resting on her growing belly. Matthew held the reins too tightly, his father's sins burning in his pocket like hot coals. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the soft thud of horse hooves in snow and the occasional creak of leather harness. Matthew wanted to speak, to reassure her, but shame sealed his lips. How could he offer comfort when his own blood carried such darkness? Ruthie pulled her shawl tighter, watching the falling snow. He could sense her tension, knew she must have heard the whispers. Still, she said nothing, allowing him his silence just as she guarded her own past hurts. The afternoon light was fading when they finally turned onto the trail leading home. Fresh snow had smoothed away their morning tracks, leaving the path pristine and untouched. Like a clean slate, Matthew thought bitterly, except nothing was ever truly clean. The past always left its mark, visible or not. Their cabin appeared through the trees, smoke curling from the chimney where they'd banked the morning fire. Matthew helped Ruthie down from the wagon, careful of her footing on the slippery ground. She paused, looking up at him with concern in her eyes, but he turned away to begin unloading supplies. Inside, Ruthie moved quietly, around the cabin, putting away purchases while Matthew tended to the horses. When he finally came in, stamping snow from his boots, she had coffee brewing on the stove. The familiar scent should have been welcoming, but even that comfort felt hollow now. He hung his coat by the door, the letter heavy in its pocket. Ruthie worked at the table, measuring flour into the bin. The silence between them had grown thick enough to touch. "I'll check the trap line before dark," he said roughly, reaching for his coat again. "Matthew." Her voice was soft but steady. "The snow's getting worse. Stay." He paused, one arm in his sleeve. Ruthie stood by the table, flour dust on her apron, concern written clearly on her face. The cabin suddenly felt too small, too close, like the walls were pressing in with all their unspoken burdens. "I need to check the traps," he insisted, but his voice lacked conviction. Ruthie nodded slowly, accepting his need to escape even if she didn't understand it. "There's stew warming on the stove when you return." Matthew pulled on his coat and stepped out into the gathering storm. Snow swirled around him, already filling in his tracks. Behind him, lamplight glowed in the cabin window, a beacon of warmth and belonging that he suddenly felt unworthy to claim. He moved through the deepening dusk, checking traps that he knew would be empty in this weather. His father's crimes weighed on him with each step. The letter had confirmed his worst fears. That darkness ran in his blood, that no matter how far he ran or how hard he prayed, he couldn't escape his inheritance of violence. The snow fell harder now, thick flakes catching in his beard. Matthew thought of Ruthie waiting in their warm cabin, trusting him to return. She'd fled her own shame to find shelter with him, never knowing she'd tied herself to a man whose father had destroyed innocent lives. Would she look at him differently if she knew? Would she see his father's darkness lurking behind his eyes? The thought twisted in his gut like a knife. Hours passed before he finally turned back toward home. Night had fully fallen, but he could see lamplight still burning in their window. Ruthie waited up for him, just as she had every night since their hasty marriage. He stood in the swirling snow, watching that steady light. Inside was warmth, acceptance, the beginning of something that might have been love. Outside was the cold truth of what he was, son of a murderer, keeper of dark secrets, unworthy of the trust she placed in him. The letter crackled in his pocket as he moved toward the cabin door. Tomorrow would bring more whispers, more knowing looks from townspeople who sensed the weight of sin around them both. But tonight, snow fell like mercy, covering their tracks and their secrets in clean white silence. Matthew reached for the door latch, then hesitated. Through the window, he could see Ruthie sitting by the fire, her Bible open on her lap. She looked up as if sensing his presence, and for a moment their eyes met through the glass. She offered a small smile, and despite everything, he felt something warm stir in his chest. Whatever came tomorrow, whatever secrets lay between them, tonight they had this: a warm cabin, a shared meal, and the quiet comfort of two wounded souls finding shelter together. Matthew squared his shoulders and opened the door, stepping out of the storm and into the light of home. February arrived with nature's full fury. The wind howled across Bitterroot Ridge like a wild thing, rattling the cabin's wooden bones. Inside, Ruthie stirred the fire while Matthew pulled on his heavy coat, preparing for another battle against the endless snow. "Storm's getting worse," he said, wrapping a wool scarf around his neck. "Need to check on the livestock." Ruthie nodded, one hand resting on her swollen belly. She was due any day now, and the thought of it kept Matthew awake at night. The nearest doctor was 2 days' ride, impossible in this weather. "Be careful out there," she said softly. The blast of cold air that followed him out nearly snuffed the lamp. Matthew trudged through knee-deep snow toward the barn, his breath freezing in his beard. The wooden structure groaned under winter's assault, but inside, the animal's body heat kept the space tolerably warm. He was checking the hay supply when he heard it. A low, distressed moan from one of the stalls. Sarah, their only milk cow, lay on her side, sides heaving. "Easy there, girl," Matthew murmured, kneeling beside her. The cow was clearly in labor, and from the look of things, something wasn't right. Hours passed as Matthew worked with the struggling animal. His hands grew numb as he reached inside to turn the calf, speaking low words of encouragement. The wind screamed outside, and chimney smoke from the cabin swirled past the barn's high window. Finally, with one last mighty effort from Sarah, the calf slid into the world. Matthew quickly cleared its nose and mouth, rubbing its chest until it drew its first shuddering breath. "That's it," he whispered. "That's it, little one." The calf was barely dry when a different sound caught his attention, a cry from the cabin. His heart stopped. Ruthie. Matthew burst through the barn door, plowing through snowdrifts toward home. Inside, he found Ruthie gripping the table edge, face twisted in pain. "The baby," she gasped. "It's coming." No, it's too early," Matthew said. But they both knew arguing with nature was useless. He helped her to their bed, his mind racing, all their preparations, and now both mother and child's lives rested in his large, clumsy hands. "Lord," he prayed aloud, "guide these hands, please." The hours that followed tested every ounce of strength they possessed. Matthew heated water, gathered clean linens, and tried to remember everything the midwife had told them during her autumn visit. Ruthie's labor pains came faster, harder, each one drawing a cry that tore at his heart. He wiped her brow with a cool cloth, supporting her as she pushed. The storm raged outside, but inside their cabin nothing existed except this battle for life. Matthew prayed continuously, sometimes in whispers, sometimes in shouts that matched Ruthie's. "I can't," Ruthie sobbed after another exhausting effort. "I can't do this." "Yes, you can," Matthew said firmly, squeezing her hand. "You're the strongest person I know. God didn't bring us together to lose you now." Another contraction seized her. Matthew positioned himself to catch the baby, remembering the calf's delivery hours before. "Push, Ruthie. Push now." With a final, tremendous effort, Ruthie bore down. Suddenly, a tiny head emerged, then shoulders. Matthew's hands trembled as he guided the infant into the world. For one terrible moment, there was silence. Then the baby drew breath and let out a powerful wail. Relief flooded through Matthew so strongly that tears spilled down his cheeks, falling onto the newborn's face as he cleared its airways. "A boy," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "We have a son, Ruthie." He wrapped the baby in warm blankets and placed him in Ruthie's arms. She looked down at their child with wonder, despite her exhaustion. "Mercy," she said softly. "His name is Mercy." Matthew nodded, understanding perfectly. After everything, the shame they'd both carried, the secrets, the judgment, here was God's answer. Pure, new life, untouched by the past. Once he'd made sure Ruthie and the baby were comfortable, Matthew tended to the fire. The storm still howled, but its fury seemed distant now, unable to touch the miracle that had occurred within these walls. Ruthie drifted into an exhausted sleep, and Matthew carefully lifted little Mercy from her arms. He settled into the rocking chair before the fire, studying his son's tiny features in the flickering light. The baby's small hand wrapped around his finger with surprising strength. Matthew rocked slowly, his heart so full it ached. "You're not alone, son," he whispered, voice rough with emotion. "None of us are." The fire crackled softly as father and son sat together through the long night. Outside, the storm gradually began to ease, as if nature herself acknowledged that something profound had occurred in this humble cabin on Bitterroot Ridge. Through the window, Matthew could see the first hint of dawn breaking. The snow had stopped falling, and a pale light touched the drifts with gold. Inside, Ruthie slept peacefully, and their son, their Mercy-made flesh, breathed softly in his arms. For the first time in months, Matthew felt truly at peace. Whatever tomorrow might bring, this moment was pure grace. In helping deliver both calf and child on this storm-racked night, he discovered something profound about life, about God's presence in the darkest hours. He looked down at his sleeping son and smiled. Whatever burdens the past held, whatever challenges the future might bring, they would face them together. Here in this cabin, on this dawn after the storm, love had made them a family. Little Mercy stirred in his arms, and Matthew began to hum an old hymn his mother had sung to him. The melody mixed with the crackling fire and the soft sounds of the new day beginning, a quiet symphony of life continuing, of hope renewed. March brought the first whispers of spring to Bitterroot Ridge. The heavy blanket of snow began its slow retreat, revealing patches of dark earth beneath. Each morning, more snowmelt trickled down the slopes, feeding the awakening streams below. Matthew stood at the edge of his small garden plot, studying the ground with careful eyes. The soil here had been enriched over winters past with manure and pine needles. Now, as the earth softened in the warming sun, it was finally time to plant. He drove his spade deep into the ground, turning over the rich dirt. The familiar work loosened something in his chest, a tension he hadn't realized he'd been carrying all winter. With each thrust of the blade, he exposed fresh soil to the strengthening sunlight. Inside the cabin, Ruthie sat in the rocking chair by the window, nursing baby Mercy. Her gentle humming drifted out through the half-open door, old hymns her mother had taught her, now passed down to her own son. The infant's tiny hand rested against her chest as he fed, his eyes heavy with contentment. "Amazing grace, how sweet the sound," she sang softly, watching Matthew work through the window. The sight of him laboring in the garden, preparing for their future, brought tears to her eyes. How different this was from the cold October day when she'd arrived, full of fear and shame. Matthew paused in his work, wiping sweat from his brow despite the crisp air. He'd already marked out neat rows with twine, ready for the early potatoes. These would be their first crop together, their first real step toward building a lasting home. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made them both look up. Matthew straightened, shading his eyes against the pale spring sun. The familiar figure of Reverend Thompson appeared around the bend, his horse picking its way carefully along the muddy trail. "Good day to you, Thorns," the preacher called out, dismounting with surprising agility for his age. His eyes took in the scene. Matthew in his garden, Ruthie at the window with the baby, the smoke rising peacefully from their chimney. "Welcome, Reverend," Matthew said, setting aside his spade and wiping his hands on his trousers. "You're just in time for dinner, if you'd care to join us." The preacher's weathered face broke into a smile. "I'd be honored. But first..." He reached into his saddlebag and withdrew a small package wrapped in brown paper. A gift for the little one. Inside the cabin, Ruthie had already set Mercy in his cradle and was pulling on her shawl. "Please, come in out of the wind," she called through the door. The three adults gathered around as the preacher unwrapped his gift, a tiny knitted blanket in soft white wool. "My sister's work," he explained. "When I wrote to her about your family, she insisted on sending it." Ruthie ran her fingers over the delicate stitches, touched by the kindness of a stranger. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "Please thank her for us." The Reverend's expression grew serious. "I owe you both an apology," he said, looking from Matthew to Ruthie. "That letter I sent after your wedding, warning against hasty marriages. I was wrong to doubt God's hand in bringing you together." Matthew nodded slowly, accepting the words. "We've all learned something about judgment this past winter," he said quietly. "Indeed." The preacher moved to the cradle where Mercy slept peacefully. "May I?" At Ruthie's nod, he placed his hand gently on the baby's head. "Lord, bless this child and the home he was born into. Let your mercy flow through this family as it has already begun to do. Amen." "Amen," Matthew and Ruthie echoed softly. The spring air had warmed enough that Ruthie suggested they take their meal outside. She spread a quilt on a dry patch of ground while Matthew carried out their simple fare: fresh bread, dried venison stew, and the last of their winter apples. They sat together beneath the pale March sky, sharing food and conversation. The preacher spoke of his circuit travels, of new settlements sprouting up in the valley below, of how the territory was changing. But mostly, he watched the small family before him, noting how naturally they moved together now, how their eyes met with quiet understanding. Ruthie was describing her plans for a kitchen garden when Matthew suddenly laughed, a free, unguarded sound that startled them all. It was the first time she'd heard him laugh like that, and the joy of it made her heart swell. The afternoon passed peacefully. When the preacher finally mounted to leave, the shadows were lengthening across the ridge. "God's grace shows itself in unexpected ways," he said, gathering his reins. "You three are proof of that." After he'd gone, Matthew and Ruthie stood together watching the sunset paint the snow-patched mountains gold. Mercy slept contentedly in his mother's arms, wrapped in his new blanket. "Matthew," Ruthie said softly, "I never properly thanked you." He turned to look at her, question in his eyes. "For not turning me away that first night, for choosing kindness when you could have chosen otherwise." Matthew was quiet for a long moment, watching the last light fade from the peaks. When he spoke, his voice was gentle. "The Lord sent me my family through a snowstorm." He smiled down at his sleeping son. "Seems to me I'm the one who should be giving thanks." They moved inside as evening settled over the ridge. Matthew built up the fire while Ruthie laid Mercy in his cradle. The flames cast a golden glow over the cabin's interior, warming the rough-hewn walls that had sheltered them through the winter. Together, they watched their son sleep peacefully. His tiny chest rose and fell with each breath, his face smooth and innocent in the firelight. Here was their miracle, their fresh start, their living proof that God's mercy could transform the darkest circumstances into something beautiful. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, and outside, a spring peeper began its evening song. Inside their humble cabin, the small family stood together in comfortable silence, their hearts full of gratitude for the unexpected path that had brought them to this moment. Ruthie leaned slightly against Matthew's arm, and he didn't move away. The simple touch spoke volumes about how far they'd come since that cold October day. Whatever the future might hold, they would face it together. Husband, wife, and child, bound not by obligation but by something deeper. Love that had grown as naturally as the spring itself. The evening deepened around them, but they lingered by the cradle, watching their son sleep in the golden firelight. Here was their reward for trusting in grace, for choosing mercy over judgment. Here was their family, built not on tradition or propriety, but on the foundation of faith and forgiveness. The late March wind carried hints of spring, but winter wasn't finished with the Montana territory. Ruthie hummed softly as she hung freshly washed clothes on the line outside their cabin. Mercy slept peacefully in his cradle nearby, wrapped snug against the mountain chill. The sound of approaching hooves made her pause, expecting Matthew returning from his supply run to Elk Crossing. Instead, she saw the storekeeper's boy, Tommy, riding hard up the trail. His face was flushed with exertion as he reined his horse to a stop. "Mrs. Thorne," he called out, breathing hard. "Pa sent me to warn you. There's a wagon come in from Missouri. 2 men asking after you." The wet sheet slipped from Ruthie's fingers, falling into the mud. Her hands began to tremble as she pressed them against her skirt. Did they give their names?" Tommy nodded. "Called themselves Callahan. Said they're looking for their sister who owes money back home." The blood drained from Ruthie's face. Caleb and Horace. Her older brothers had tracked her here, all the way from Missouri. The same brothers who'd laughed the loudest when their father had sent her away in disgrace. "Thank you, Tommy," she managed to say. "Please tell Mr. Thorne if you see him in town." As the boy rode away, Ruthie hurried to gather Mercy from his cradle. Inside the cabin, she paced, holding her son close. The brothers who'd mocked her pregnancy, who'd treated her shame as a family joke. They were here. But why? What could they want after all this time? The afternoon light was growing thin when she heard Matthew's wagon approaching. He entered quickly, his usual quiet manner tinged with tension. "You heard?" Ruthie asked, though she could see the answer in his face. Matthew nodded, hanging his coat by the door. "Saw them myself at the store. They're asking questions, showing people a paper they claim is proof you took money before leaving." He moved to stand near her and Mercy, his presence solid and reassuring. "The storekeeper warned me they've been drinking, getting louder about their grievances." Ruthie clutched Mercy tighter. "They have no right," she whispered. "I never took anything." "I know." Matthew's voice was gentle but firm. "This house is yours, same as mine. No one's going to force you from it." She looked up at him, seeing the quiet strength in his eyes. This was the man who'd married her to spare her shame, who'd helped deliver her son in a blizzard, who'd never once made her feel unwelcome. "They might try to take Mercy," she said, voicing her deepest fear. Matthew's expression hardened. "They won't." He moved to check the window shutters, testing their latches. "We'll bar the doors tonight. I've asked some neighbors to keep watch on the trail." Outside, the wind was picking up, carrying the first flakes of new snow. Ruthie watched them swirl past the window as Matthew methodically secured their home. The familiar sounds of his boots on the wooden floor, his sure movements as he stacked firewood inside and checked his rifle, helped calm her racing heart. As darkness fell, the snow began falling harder. Matthew lit the lamps and built up the fire, while Ruthie prepared a simple supper neither of them would eat much of. Mercy nursed and fell asleep, unaware of the tension filling his usual peaceful home. They sat together by the fire, listening to the wind and the occasional pop of burning wood. Ruthie's thoughts kept returning to that morning months ago when she'd overheard her brothers laughing with their father, planning to answer Matthew's marriage advertisement in her name. They'd thought it hilarious to send their disgraced sister west to an unknown man, never expecting she'd find kindness instead of further cruelty. "Tell me about them," Matthew said quietly, breaking the long silence. "Help me understand what we're facing." Ruthie wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "Caleb's the oldest, 32 now. He's always been Papa's voice, quick to judge and quicker to act. Horace is 28, follows whatever Caleb does. She stared into the fire. They were different once, when Mama was alive, but after she died, they grew hard, cruel even. Matthew nodded slowly. And they helped send you away. They thought it was funny, Ruthie whispered, the old pain surfacing. Sending their ruined sister to be some stranger's problem, they never expected. She gestured at their home, at Sleeping Mercy, at the life they'd built. They never expected I'd find happiness. Maybe that's what brings them here, Matthew suggested. News travels. Maybe they heard you're doing well, and it spoils their joke. A particularly strong gust rattled the window shutters. Ruthie jumped, and Matthew moved instinctively closer to her. Chair. The snow was falling heavily now, blanketing the valley in white silence. Somewhere in that silence, her brothers were waiting, planning their next move. Matthew stood and checked the door's heavy bar again. Whatever they want, they'll find more than they bargained for here. His voice was quiet, but carried an edge of steel she'd never heard before. You're not alone anymore, Ruthie. She watched him move about the cabin. This good man who'd become her protector, her partner, her husband in more than just name. The warmth of the fire and his steady presence gradually eased some of her fear. They'd weathered storms before, the literal blizzard of Mercy's birth, the figurative storms of gossip and judgment. They would weather this one too. Mercy stirred in his cradle, making small sounds in his sleep. Ruthie went to him, touching his soft cheek. All the joy and peace she'd found in this mountain home, all the healing and hope, she would fight to protect it. Her brothers might have sent her west as a cruel joke, but God had turned their mockery into mercy. The night deepened, and the snow continued to fall. Matthew took the first watch while Ruthie tried to sleep, his rifle across his knees as he sat by the window. The fire's glow cast his shadow large against the cabin wall, a sentinel against the darkness and whatever it might bring. Through the cabin's thick logs came the lonely howl of a wolf, answered by another far across the valley. The sound echoed off the snow-covered ridges, a wild reminder that nature itself stood guard tonight. Ruthie pulled her quilt tighter, drawing strength from the solid walls around her, from Matthew's watchful presence, from Sleeping Mercy's peaceful breathing. Her brothers might have come to cause trouble, but they'd find more than the shamed, helpless sister they'd sent away. They'd find a woman who'd built a new life, a mother fierce to protect her child, a wife matched with a husband who understood the true meaning of family. The valley had grown quiet and tense, muffled under its fresh blanket of snow. But inside the thorn cabin, love stood guard against hate, and mercy waited to triumph over cruelty. Whatever morning might bring, they would face it together. Through the night, Matthew and Ruthie took turns watching, their whispered conversations a comfort against the darkness. They spoke of practical things, supplies laid in, neighbors to call on if needed, escape routes to the North Ridge. But they also spoke of deeper matters, of faith tested by trial, of family bonds forged by choice rather than blood, of the strength found in standing together against threat. The snow fell steadily, erasing tracks and smoothing the rough landscape into pristine white. Nature itself seemed to be drawing a clean page, ready for whatever story tomorrow would write. Inside their snug cabin, the small family waited, protected by more than just wooden walls and iron bars, protected by the bonds of love and trust they'd built through a long winter of learning each other's hearts. As the night wore on, Ruthie found herself remembering her prayer from that first day on the wagon seat, heading west into uncertainty. Lord, just let someone be kind. How abundantly that simple prayer had been answered. Now she prayed again, watching Matthew's strong profile as he guarded their door. Lord, let us be worthy of the mercy you've shown us. Let us be strong enough to face whatever comes. The fire burned low, and the snow continued to fall. The pale winter dawn crept over Bitterroot Ridge, painting the fresh snow in shades of rose and gold. Matthew had kept the last watch, letting Ruthie sleep with Mercy nestled against her. He'd just stoked the morning fire when he heard it, the distant crunch of hooves on snow, followed by angry voices carrying through the crystal-clear mountain air. "Ruthie!" The shout shattered the morning stillness. "Get out here, sister." Matthew's hand moved to his rifle, but his movements remained deliberate, calm. He glanced at Ruthie, who was already awake, clutching Mercy to her chest. Her face had gone pale, but her chin lifted with quiet determination. "Stay inside," Matthew said softly, shrugging into his heavy coat. He left it unbuttoned, keeping his movements free. The rifle felt solid in his hands as he stepped onto the front porch, his boots crunching on the fresh-fallen snow. Two riders sat their horses at the edge of the yard, their breath steaming in the cold air. Matthew recognized them from the store clerk's description: Caleb, the elder, broad-shouldered and sneering, and Horace, thinner but with the same hard eyes as his brother. Their horses shifted nervously in the snow, sensing the tension. "Where's our sister?" Caleb demanded, his voice harsh in the morning quiet. "We've come to take her home." Matthew's voice carried clearly across the yard. "Mrs. Thorne is my wife now. She is home." Horace spat into the snow. "That ain't what we heard in town. Heard she's carrying the deacon's bastard. Stole away with his child, she did." The cabin door creaked open behind Matthew. Despite his wish for her to stay inside, he wasn't surprised to hear Ruthie's soft footsteps on the porch. She stood beside him now, Mercy bundled against her chest, refusing to hide. "You want the truth, brothers?" Her voice trembled but held firm. "I'll give it to you plain. Yes, the child was the deacon's, but I bore him in silence to protect his wife's good name. She'd suffered enough, watching him stray. I wouldn't add public shame to her private grief." Caleb's face darkened with rage. "So you admit it? Stealing away with another woman's husband's child?" He swung down from his horse, taking a threatening step forward. "You're coming back with us, sister. Time to face what you've done." Matthew's rifle came up slightly, not aimed but ready. "That's far enough." But Ruthie stepped forward, her voice stronger now. "I faced what I'd done every day in Missouri. Faced your mockery, faced Papa's shame, faced the town's whispers. Then you thought to make sport of me, sending me west to marry a stranger." She looked up at Matthew, her eyes bright with tears but her voice steady. "God turned your cruelty to kindness. Matthew is twice the man of honor you'll ever be." Horace dismounted now, too, flanking his brother. "Honor?" he sneered. "Living in sin with our disgraced sister, claiming another man's get as his own?" "We were married proper," Matthew said quietly. "By a traveling preacher before God and witnesses. Mercy is my son now, same as if I'd sired him myself." His finger rested near, but not on, the rifle's trigger. "You'll leave her be or face God sooner than you planned." Something in his voice, the absolute certainty, the calm promise of violence if needed, made both brothers pause. They glanced at each other, measuring the steel in Matthew's stance, the quiet dignity in Ruthie's face. "This ain't over," Caleb growled, but he took a step back. "We'll be back with the deacon himself. He's out west now looking for his boy. We'll bring him and the law down on your heads." "The law will hear truth," Ruthie said softly. "About the deacon, about your cruel joke in sending me here, about everything. I'm not afraid anymore." Snow began falling again, thick flakes swirling between the opposing groups. Horace mounted first, tugging his collar up against the cold. Caleb followed more slowly, his face dark with thwarted rage. "You'll regret this, sister," he called as they turned their horses. "Mark my words." Matthew and Ruthie stood silent on the porch, watching until the riders disappeared into the thickening snow. Only then did Matthew lower his rifle, turning to his wife with concern in his eyes. "Are you all right?" Ruthie nodded, her arms tightening around Mercy, who had slept through the whole confrontation. "I never thought I'd find the strength to face them," she whispered, "but standing here with you—" She looked up at him, her eyes shining with gratitude and something deeper. "You gave me that strength, Matthew. You and this home we've made." Matthew gently touched her cheek, brushing away a tear with his rough thumb. "You had that strength all along, Ruthie. You just needed someone to believe in it." He glanced at the snow-filled valley where her brothers had vanished. "We'll face whatever comes together." The snow fell harder now, erasing the horses' tracks, as if nature itself wanted to wipe away the morning's ugliness. Matthew guided Ruthie back inside, where the fire still burned warm and bright. He barred the door, but knew the real threat wasn't over. Her brothers would return, probably with the deacon and whatever law they could muster. But watching Ruthie settle in her chair by the fire, humming softly to Mercy as she nursed him, Matthew felt a fierce certainty grow in his heart. This was his family now, given to him by God's grace. He'd walked a lonely path most of his life, bearing his father's sins in solitude. But now he had something worth fighting for, worth dying for if need be. The morning's confrontation had changed something between them. In standing together against her brothers, they'd forged something stronger than their marriage of convenience, deeper than their growing friendship. Matthew saw it in the way Ruthie looked at him now, with trust, with gratitude, with a warmth that made his heart ache. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing their mountain home in pristine white. Inside, the little family drew closer together, finding strength in their unity, preparing for whatever storms might come next. They had chosen each other, claimed each other before God and man. No force on earth would tear them apart now. "I meant what I said," Matthew told her quietly as he hung his rifle back on its pegs. "Mercy is my son. No deacon or law will change that." Ruthie's smile was like sunrise breaking through clouds. "I know," she said simply. "God sent us to each other for a reason, even if it started as my brother's cruel joke." The fire crackled, spreading its warmth through the cabin. Mercy made small, contented sounds as he nursed. For now, at least, their home remained a sanctuary of peace, built on faith, defended by love. Let the world bring its storms. They would weather them together. 2 days after the confrontation at the cabin, hoofbeats echoed through the morning air. Matthew and Ruthie stood on their porch, watching a group approach through the swirling snow. The brothers rode at the front, followed by Reverend Mills, the circuit preacher, and several townspeople from Elk Crossing. Matthew's hand found Ruthie's, squeezing gently. "Remember," he whispered, "truth is our shield." The group reined up in the yard, snow crushing beneath the horses' hooves. Caleb Callahan's voice rang out harsh and accusing. "There they stand, the false wife and her deceived husband." Reverend Mills dismounted slowly, his weathered face grave. "Matthew Thorne, Ruthie Callahan. Serious accusations have been brought before me. These men claim your marriage was built on lies." "Let's take this to holy ground," Horace called out. "The churchyard's where such matters belong." Matthew nodded quietly. "We'll come." He helped Ruthie wrap Mercy warmly, then hitched their wagon. The procession moved slowly through the snow toward the small church at the edge of town. In the churchyard, bare trees stood like sentinels against the gray sky. The townsfolk gathered in a loose circle, their breath clouding in the cold air. Mercy slept peacefully in Ruthie's arms, bundled against her chest. "Speak your piece," Reverend Mills said to the brothers. Caleb stepped forward, boots crunching in the snow. This woman fled Missouri in disgrace, carrying another man's child. She deceived Matthew Thorne about her condition, stole away with the deacon's son. "That's not true," Matthew said firmly. "I knew of her condition before we married." "A marriage that shouldn't have happened," Horace cut in. "She came west on false pretenses, answering a letter meant for our other sister. The whole thing's built on deceit." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. The Reverend turned to Ruthie, his expression troubled. "Child, is this true? Did you come here under false circumstances?" Snow fell softly as Ruthie stepped forward. Her voice was quiet but clear, carrying across the hushed churchyard. "I came here sent as a joke," she admitted, meeting the preacher's eyes. "My family thought to shame me further by sending me west to a stranger." She glanced at Matthew, drawing strength from his steady presence. "But God gave me a husband who feared heaven more than shame." The crowd stirred. Several women whispered together, their faces softening as they looked at Ruthie and the sleeping baby. Reverend Mills stroked his graying beard, studying the couple before him. "Matthew, you chose to marry her, knowing everything?" "I did," Matthew said simply. "The Lord sent her to my door in need. I chose to offer shelter, then marriage, of my own free will." "A marriage built on lies cannot stand blessed by the church," Caleb protested. The Reverend held up his hand for silence. His eyes were troubled as he looked between the angry brothers and the quiet couple. "This requires prayer and consideration," he announced finally. "I must investigate these claims, speak to others who knew the circumstances. Before I can bless this union anew or dissolve it, I must be certain of God's will in this matter." Ruthie's hand trembled in Matthew's grip, but her voice remained steady. "We welcome truth, Reverend. Let it show what's in all our hearts." Matthew squared his shoulders, speaking loud enough for all to hear. "Let truth find us," he agreed. "We have nothing to hide." The crowd began to disperse, their muttered conversations carried away on the wind. Caleb and Horace mounted their horses, trading dark looks. "This isn't finished," Caleb warned as they rode away. The Reverend approached Matthew and Ruthie. "I'll need time," he said quietly. "Continue as you are until I return with my decision. And pray, children. Pray for guidance." Matthew helped Ruthie into their wagon, tucking the blankets around her and Mercy. The snow squeaked beneath their wheels as they drove home, the silence between them heavy with unspoken fears. But their clasped hands spoke of a deeper truth. Whatever judgment came, they would face it together. A week passed like honey dripping from a winter-stored comb. The snow began its slow retreat, leaving patches of muddy earth exposed beneath the towering pines. Ruthie kept to the cabin, holding Mercy close as she went about her daily tasks. Her hands trembled less with each passing day, but fear had made its home in her heart. The mail rider's arrival broke their careful routine. Matthew met him at the gate, took the letter, and stood, reading it in the yard. His shoulders tensed. When he came inside, his face was grave. "The deacon," he said quietly. "Hiram Lowe is coming from Missouri. Says he means to claim the child." Ruthie's legs gave way. She sank into the rocking chair, clutching Mercy to her chest. "No," she whispered. "Please, no." Matthew knelt beside her, his large hand gentle on her arm. "I won't let him take our son." He pulled out paper and ink, his writing careful and measured as he composed a letter to Reverend Mills. "We'll request a proper hearing. Let truth stand in God's light." The next 3 days stretched endless. Ruthie jumped at every sound, every distant hoofbeat. Matthew took to sleeping in the chair by the door, his rifle across his knees. Even little Mercy seemed to sense the tension, fussing more than usual in the dark hours. Word spread through Elk Crossing like wildfire. The deacon was coming. Townsfolk whispered behind their hands, some pitying, others judgmental. A few brought food to the cabin: bread, preserves, early spring greens, silent offerings of support. When Deacon Hiram Lowe finally rode in, the whole town gathered to witness. He came not proudly as expected, but slumped in his saddle, his face the color of old ashes. His hands shook as he dismounted before the church. Matthew and Ruthie arrived last, their wagon creaking to a stop. The crowd parted as they walked forward, Mercy bundled against the morning chill. Reverend Mills stood waiting on the church steps, his Bible held like a shield. "Deacon Lowe," the Reverend began, "you've come a long way to make your claim." But Hiram Lowe wasn't looking at the Reverend. His eyes fixed on Ruthie, then dropped to the ground. His voice came out thin and trembling. "I've come to speak truth," he said. "God's conviction weighs too heavy to bear anymore." The crowd pressed closer. Ruthie felt Matthew's hand steady at her back. "Before these witnesses," Hiram continued, each word seeming to cost him dearly, "I confess my sin. The child is mine, yes, but the greater sin was letting Ruthie bear my shame." He raised his head at last, tears tracking down his dusty cheeks. "She took the blame to protect my wife's standing in our church. My wife, who was dying of consumption at the time. Ruthie sacrificed her own name to spare a dying woman pain." A gasp rippled through the onlookers. Several women covered their mouths. The brothers, Caleb and Horace, shifted uneasily at the edge of the crowd. "My wife passed this winter," Hiram went on. "Her last words were of forgiveness. For me, for Ruthie, for all of it. I couldn't live with the lie anymore." He fell to his knees in the muddy snow. "I don't come to claim the child. I come to beg forgiveness." Reverend Mills had lowered his head, shame evident in every line of his face. He had been quick to judge, slow to defend. Now truth stripped away all pretense. Ruthie swayed on her feet. The fear that had gripped her heart for so long began to dissolve, replaced by a wave of relief so powerful it nearly brought her to her knees. Matthew's arm slipped around her waist, holding her steady. Then Matthew stepped forward, lifting Mercy high in his strong arms. The baby's face caught the morning sun, his innocent eyes bright as stars. Matthew's voice rang out clear and strong across the churchyard. "Then the Lord himself will be this child's father," he declared, "as he is father to us all." Silence fell over the gathering. In that holy hush, truth had done its work. Ruthie's name was cleared, the weight of secrets lifted, and in Matthew's arms little Mercy cooed, unaware that his very existence had brought healing to wounded hearts and light to hidden shadows. The townsfolk began to move forward, one by one, offering hands of fellowship to Ruthie. Women who had turned away now embraced her. Men who had judged nodded respectfully to Matthew. Even Caleb and Horace stood awkward and uncertain, their mockery silenced by truth's simple power. Morning broke clear and bright over Elk Crossing, the sun gleaming off patches of lingering snow. The townsfolk gathered early at the small church, their breath visible in the crisp air. Inside, someone had scattered pine boughs along the wooden benches, their fresh scent mixing with wood smoke from the pot-bellied stove. Reverend Mills stood before the congregation, his weathered face solemn. "Before we proceed," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I must ask forgiveness. I judged harshly what I did not understand. I failed to see God's hand at work in bringing these two souls together." Matthew and Ruthie stood before him, Mercy nestled in his mother's arms. The morning light through the windows caught the silver threads in Matthew's dark hair and made Ruthie's eyes shine like amber, their hands clasped tight, steady and sure. "This," the Reverend declared, "is a covenant stronger than any I've seen, built not on convenience or custom, but on mercy itself. His voice grew stronger as he led them through their vows again, this time before the whole town, as witness. After the ceremony, women approached with peace offerings, carefully stitched quilts and fresh-baked bread still warm from their ovens. Each gift came with tearful embraces for Ruthie, who accepted them with quiet grace. Matthew took the carved wooden cross he'd made for Mercy's cradle and presented it to the Reverend, who received it with bowed head. As evening settled over the valley, neighbors filled the cabin with the sound of hymns. Voices rose and fell like winter wind through pine boughs, while Mercy slept peacefully in his cradle. In the shadows near the door, Caleb and Horace Callahan stood awkwardly for a moment before slipping away into the gathering dusk, shame finally overtaking their pride. The fire burned low in the hearth as the last guests departed. Matthew drew Ruthie close, his large hand gentle on her shoulder. "Listen," he whispered, as Mercy's soft laughter bubbled up from his cradle. "That sound right there. It made a home out of a trapper's den." Ruthie leaned into his embrace, tears trailing down her cheeks, even as she smiled. In that moment, surrounded by the warmth of acceptance and love, the cabin seemed to glow with a light that had nothing to do with firelight or stars. The warm May breeze carried the scent of pine and fresh-cut timber up Bitterroot Ridge. Matthew Thorne stood back, wiping sweat from his brow as he studied his old trapper's lean-to. The rough shelter had served him through many lonely winters, but now its weathered logs would find a higher purpose. "Reckon it's time," he said quietly, gripping his axe handle. The lean-to came down slowly, each log carefully preserved. Matthew worked methodically, sorting usable timber from what had rotted. His massive hands, once skilled only in setting traps and skinning pelts, now moved with the careful precision of a builder. Ruthie watched from the cabin porch, Mercy cradled in her arms. The baby cooed and reached toward his father with tiny fingers. "He likes watching you work," she called softly, and Matthew's face creased in a gentle smile. Day by day, the chapel took shape. Matthew added fresh-cut logs to the salvaged ones, crafting a simple but sturdy structure. He built it in a natural hollow just below their cabin, where morning light streamed through the trees. The work drew curious onlookers from town, some offering help, others standing back to watch and whisper. "What's he building way up here?" they'd ask. And Ruthie would answer with quiet certainty. "A place for prayer?" The same women who had once crossed the street to avoid her now brought food for the workers. Children who had pointed and whispered behind their hands now played near the construction, watching wide-eyed as the walls rose higher. Matthew welcomed them all with his characteristic silent nod, accepting their presence as naturally as he accepted the changing seasons. One afternoon, Mrs. Peterson, the storekeeper's wife who had been among the first to spread gossip about Ruthie's arrival, approached the cabin with a bundle wrapped in cloth. "It's curtains," she said hesitantly, "for the chapel windows, if you'd like them." Ruthie accepted them with grace, recognizing the offering for what it was, a bridge across the gulf of judgment. "Perhaps you'd like to join us for Bible study when the chapel's finished?" she asked, and saw tears spring to the older woman's eyes. As spring deepened into summer, Matthew installed simple benches and a rough-hewn pulpit. Above the door, he carved the words, "Mercy Hollow Chapel," in clean, deep letters. Ruthie ran her fingers over them, remembering the day he had carved her new name into their cabin's timber post. Soon, women and children began gathering regularly to hear Ruthie teach Bible verses. Her quiet voice carried through the chapel's open windows, mixing with bird song and the rustle of leaves. Even those who had once mocked her sat attentive, watching as she bounced Mercy on her knee while explaining scripture with simple, heartfelt words. Travelers passing through the valley began stopping at Mercy Hollow. Word spread that anyone could find a bowl of hot stew and a moment of peace there. Matthew would welcome them with few words but genuine warmth, while Ruthie's cooking filled the air with homey scents that reminded weary wanderers of hearth and hope. One evening, as the sun painted the western ridge in shades of gold and purple, Matthew hung a small iron bell in the chapel's modest tower. He'd traded 3 prime beaver pelts for it in town, declaring it worth every one. The bell's clear tone rang out across the valley for the first time, just as dusk was settling in. Ruthie stood in the chapel doorway, Mercy held close against her shoulder. "Listen, little one," she whispered as the sound echoed off the ridges. The baby giggled and waved his arms at the new sound, his laughter as pure as the bell's tone. Matthew joined them, his big hand resting gently on Mercy's head. "This cabin was born of ridicule," he said softly, "but now it shelters praise." His voice carried the wonder of a man who had witnessed miracle after quiet miracle. The evening wind caught the bell's lingering tone, carrying it down the valley like a blessing. From their vantage point, they could see lights beginning to twinkle in distant windows, as if in answer to the bell's call to peace. The hollow that had once echoed with only wolf howls and wind now rang with something sweeter, the sound of community and grace. Ruthie leaned against her husband's solid strength, remembering that cold October morning when she'd left Missouri in shame. "Who could have known?" she murmured, watching Mercy reach toward the fading sunlight. "Who could have known that being sent away as a joke would lead to all this?" The bell continued its gentle song as darkness settled over Bitterroot Ridge. Its clear voice spoke of redemption, of ridicule transformed to reverence, of a trapper's solitary shelter expanded into sanctuary. In Mercy Hollow, peace had found a home, and grace had built itself a dwelling place. 10 years had carved gentle lines around Ruthie's eyes, each one earned through nights of worry and days of joy. The cabin on Bitterroot Ridge stood larger now, with fresh-cut windows letting in mountain light. Matthew had added rooms as their family grew, but the heart of their home remained that first warm hearth where Mercy had found them both. On winter evenings, settlers gathering at Elk Crossing Trading Post would share tales of the Thorns cabin. "That lamplight saved my life," Jake Henderson testified, describing how he'd followed its glow through a blinding February storm. "Found myself snowblind and freezing, till I seen that window gleaming like God's own star." Sarah Miller, now grown with children of her own, told how the light had guided her family's wagon through treacherous mountain passes. "Mrs. Thorne took us in, fed us hot stew, and wouldn't hear of payment. Said helping others was payment enough for what the Lord had done for her." The stories spread down the valley and beyond, tales of a home where no traveler was turned away, where shame transformed into shelter, and where a single lamp burned bright against the darkness. Some spoke of hearing hymns carried on the wind, others of prayers that seemed to make the very mountains bow their heads in reverence. Inside the cabin this evening, Ruthie's rocking chair creaked softly as she held 10-year-old Mercy. The boy's dark curls caught firelight as he dozed, reminding her of those first uncertain days when he'd been nothing but a flutter beneath her heart and a prayer upon her lips. Now he was strong and kind like his father, quick to help lost travelers and quicker still to forgive. Matthew sat in his chair by the hearth, his Bible open to the Psalms. Years of working wood and praise had weathered his hands, but they turned the pages with the same gentle reverence she'd first noticed that snowy night when he'd taken her in. The flames cast dancing shadows across the walls as his deep voice filled the room. "He brought me up also out of an horrible pit, out of the miry clay, and set my feet upon a rock, and established my goings." Matthew read from Psalm 40. His voice caught slightly. It always did at these words. "And he hath put a new song in my mouth, even praise unto our God. Many shall see it, and fear, and shall trust in the Lord." Closing the Bible, Matthew looked up at his wife and son. "Lord," he prayed, voice thick with gratitude, "you turned our shame into blessing. You made mockery into mercy. Where there was loneliness, you built family. Where there was scorn, you planted praise." Ruthie's eyes misted as she remembered that cold October dawn when she'd left Missouri, certain she'd never know kindness again. Now the valley itself seemed to cradle them in grace, and their story had become a testament to God's faithful love. Snow fell in soft curtains outside the windows, each flake catching lamplight like a tiny star. As they prepared for bed, Matthew moved through the familiar ritual of checking the lamp oil. They never let it run low. Too many lives depended on that steady gleam cutting through mountain storms. Just as he reached to extinguish the flame, a sound drifted through the winter air, the sweet, clear tone of bells from Mercy Hollow Chapel. Though distance softened their song, the notes rang true and clean, calling the faithful to remember and the lost to find their way home. The Thorns' cabin glowed golden against the snow-draped ridge, its light spilling across fresh drifts like honey. From the valley below, it must have looked like a beacon of hope, a reminder that no soul was truly unwanted, that grace could find the most hidden heart, that love's light could pierce the deepest dark. Inside, Matthew and Ruthie held each other close, listening to their son's steady breathing and the faint echo of bells. Their home stood as testament to a truth they'd learned through tears and trust, that God's mercy could take the world's cruelest jokes and transform them into its greatest blessings. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.